Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive with us. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the Science of Identity Foundation. You might know it as the Chris Butler cult, which some people call it. And we've got like a whole bunch of sources this time, you guys. It's a little crazy. Facebook posts, some court documents, even what looked like internal stuff from the organization itself.
Yeah, it is a very complicated picture.
Definitely complicated.
Mm.
Our mission, if we choose to accept it, is to sort through all this and see if we can understand the Science of Identity Foundation. What's real, what's maybe not so real, and what can we learn about this group?
Yeah, and I think with new religious movements especially, like you said, it's complicated because they often operate in a very insular way, creating their own sort of internal logic and power structures.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Where do we even start with something like this?
Well, I think the central figure in all of this is Chris Butler. He's the founder or leader of the Science of Identity Foundation. And right away, you see this huge contrast in how he's perceived, right? To some, he's this revered spiritual leader. But to others, he's this like manipulative cult figure.
That's so interesting how one person can be seen so differently.
Mm.
Do the sources give us any clues as to why these perceptions are so divided?
They do, yeah. For example, one of the documents, Chris Butler Sidiswara Pananasias Varap 0011 Elome DDF, which seems to be like a collection of Facebook posts from ex-members, focuses on this accusation that Butler broke traditional Gaudiya Sannyasa vows by marrying Wailana, who runs a successful business, which goes against the whole idea of renunciation that those vows represent.
So people are calling him out for hypocrisy, basically. Like he's preaching one thing, this detachment from like material wealth, but then living a totally different way?
Exactly, yeah. And it makes you question his authenticity as a spiritual leader. If he's not following the principles he's promoting, what does that say about his teachings?
That's a great point. What else do these sources say about Butler himself?
Oh, there are some pretty dark accusations, like in Flashlight on Roaches 00123.pdf. This one claims Butler would incorporate graphic descriptions of gay sex into his public lectures, even though the organization is outwardly opposed to homosexuality.
Whoa, that's a little jarring. Does it say why he would do that?
No, not really, but it's definitely another example of this disconnect between his words and actions, like we saw with the Sannyasa vows.
Yeah, for sure. Makes you wonder what his motivation is. Anything else about Butler's behavior?
There's this anecdote in Ramaranson 00136.pdf about Butler being afraid of this guy, Larry Mayo, who's supposedly connected to organized crime. So the source claims Butler was so afraid of this Mayo guy that he, like, had an escape hatch installed in his house.
Wait, what?
Yeah, but get this, he didn't offer the same protection to his followers who were living in the same house with him.
Hold on. He's worried about his own safety, but not the safety of his followers, living under the same roof. Okay, that seems a little suspicious.
Right. It's like he's putting his own well-being above the people he's supposed to be guiding and protecting. Fits into that hypocrisy thing we were talking about, I guess.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Okay, so we have these accusations of hypocrisy, maybe reckless behavior even. Do any of the sources talk about money? Like the finances of the Science of Identity Foundation?
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's one of the most consistent themes, actually. There are accusations of financial exploitation all over the place.
Okay, let's dive into that. What are they saying specifically?
Well, Chris Butler, Sidiswara Pananda Sidisavara 0001120.pdf goes into a lot of detail. It claims that Butler has amassed a huge personal fortune, but at the same time, many of his followers were really struggling financially, and they got very little support from the organization. They even say he demanded tithes, like followers had to give 10% of their income, but instead of that money going to the temples, it would be inherited by his family.
Oh, wow. So not only is he getting rich, allegedly, while his followers are struggling, but he's taking money meant for the temples.
That's what they're saying, yeah. And Iwa Achatanya Mission Palesho 00165.pdf backs that up. It claims the Science of Identity Foundation sold a bunch of properties that were meant for religious use, but they never said what happened to the money from those sales.
It's like so many contradictions. They're preaching simplicity and detachment from material wealth, but then there's all these accusations about financial shadiness and getting rich.
Yeah, it's a pretty big contrast.
It is, yeah. Anything else in the sources about this financial stuff?
Oh, yeah, there's this one story about devotees working full-time for the organization, but they couldn't even afford to eat. Like, they were struggling to afford basic food, even though the group clearly had a lot of money. Makes you wonder where all that money was going, if not to help the people who were dedicating their lives to the movement.
Oh, man, that's just sad. You'd think a spiritual organization would take care of its members, right?
Yeah.
Especially the ones who are so devoted.
Yeah, it definitely raises some big questions, especially when you consider the power dynamics within these types of groups.
Okay, so we've got this picture starting to form, right? A potentially hypocritical leader, accusations of financial exploitation, and a lot of unanswered questions about where all the money is going. What's next? Where do we go from here?
Well, have you noticed how politics keeps popping up in all of this?
You know what? Now that you mention it, the name Tulsi Gabbard was in one of those sources. Database is 00onetime.pdf. Why is she connected to this?
Apparently, Gabbard's family has close ties to the Science of Identity Foundation, and there's evidence that members have made some pretty big political donations.
Interesting. So now we have this connection between the spiritual organization and politics. What does that mean, do the sources say?
Flashlight on Roach's 0000123.pdf suggests that some of Gabbard's political stances, especially her support for anti-gay agendas, might be because of her connection to Butler and the Science of Identity Foundation.
Well, that's interesting considering what we just learned about the organization's stance on homosexuality. Anything else in the sources about politics?
Romoranson 000136.pdf has this crazy story about a movie investment that went bad because of alleged ties to the group. There were also these rumors about drug rings, which, surprise, surprise, all leads back to Butler in the end.
This is getting more and more complex. Spirituality, money, politics, maybe even criminal activity. What's going on here?
Well, it's starting to look like a classic case of a dangerous and manipulative group, right? But we have to remember that we're mainly hearing from ex-members, people who have their own experiences and maybe their own issues with the group.
You're right. We need to be careful about believing just one side of the story. Are there any sources that offer a different view?
You know what? There are, and that's where things get really interesting. Keeping Faith with Katuri.pdf is interesting. It talks about this thing called dependent psychology in these kinds of religious movements.
So you're saying this kind of dynamic where people become like super reliant on a guru, that happens a lot, not just in the Science of Identity Foundation.
Right, yeah. The book argues that this tendency toward dependence, it kind of comes with the territory in certain systems, ones that are really big on hierarchy and authority, you know? Doesn't even have to be religious, could be political groups, even like corporate stuff.
It's like people are looking for answers, they find a strong personality, and they kind of lose themselves a bit, give up their own thinking, you know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. And that takes us back to that letter from that disciple in Charis Na Karunya letter-n.pdf. They're wrestling with that very thing, wanting to learn more, but feeling held back by the Science of Identity Foundation and their focus on Butler.
Oh, right, right. They were scared to even look at other teachings, right?
Yeah.
Worried about the pressure to stay in line.
Exactly. Textbook case of what Keeping Faith Katuri.pdf is saying about that whole dependent psychology thing. The disciple wants something more, but the group's demands are holding them back.
So we've got this big conflict happening externally, all these accusations and stuff. But then there's this internal conflict, too, within the people who get caught up in it.
It's like layers, man. And it really shows just how hard it is to figure out what's true and what's just manipulation in groups like this.
Yeah, you start to see how someone could get pulled in. Do any of the sources give us, like, I don't know, advice?
Yeah.
How to think about all this?
Well, Keeping Faith with Katuri.pdf touches on something that might help. It's called dependent psychology, where followers become too reliant on their guru.
So this kind of dynamic, it's not unique to the Science of Identity Foundation.
Right. It's saying that this need to depend on someone can happen anywhere with a strong hierarchy.
So people are drawn to strong personalities, but then they might start losing their own ability to think critically.
That's a great way to put it. And it brings us back to that letter from the disciple in Charis Na Karunya letter-n.pdf. They want a richer spiritual life, but feel trapped.
Yeah, they even said that they're afraid to look at other teachings because of the pressure to stick with Butler and the Science of Identity Foundation.
It's a perfect example of that dependent psychology from Keeping Faith with Katuri.pdf. They're torn between what they want and what the group demands.
So we've got this outward conflict with all these accusations and an inner conflict in those who get caught up in the system.
It's complicated, for sure, and it shows how hard it is to separate truth from manipulation.
It also makes you think about the leader's role. Like, if they know this dependence thing can happen, are they doing anything to encourage people to think for themselves?
That's the question, right? And it's something to think about more. What has stood out to you from all this?
Well, the Science of Identity Foundation is definitely controversial. Some really troubling things are being said about Butler and what the group does. But then we see these ideas of dependence and arguments about religious freedom, and it's not so simple.
It's anything but simple.
What would you say to someone listening who's thinking, this sounds like a group I know, or I've met someone like Chris Butler?
I'd say trust your gut. If something feels wrong, if there's pressure or manipulation, step back and think about it. It's super important to get opinions from people outside the group and do your own research.
That's good advice. It's easy to get caught up in the message, especially when it seems to have all the answers or offers a place to belong. But all relationships, whether spiritual or not, should have respect and honesty.
Totally. And if you ever feel unsure or confused, remember there's help out there. Organizations like the International Cultic Studies Association can help people who've been in these tough situations with cults or high control groups.
Good to know about those resources. So we've got accusations, different sides of the story, and all this psychology stuff. Where do we go from here?
We have to admit we've only scratched the surface. There's way more to the Science of Identity Foundation than what we've covered. We haven't even talked about what they believe exactly or the role of Wyalana, Butler's wife.
You're right, and we still don't know a lot about how the organization works from the inside or what people who've been involved have gone through.
This is a topic that needs more attention and careful thought.
For sure. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the big takeaway for our listeners?
I think, the big takeaway for me at least is that we all need to be more aware of these power dynamics and how people can influence us. And it doesn't just happen in religious groups either, right? It can happen anywhere. It's easy to get caught up in someone's personality or their message without really stopping to think about what's going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think looking at this Science of Identity Foundation, it really shows why it's so important to think critically about things. A group can seem like a safe place, a spiritual haven or whatever, but then you find out they're doing things that could be really harmful.
Right. And like we were talking about before, it's not always easy to figure out what's really going on. It's complicated. So yeah, always be questioning things, look for different points of view, and watch out for any group or leader that doesn't want you to think for yourself or demands you do everything they say.
You're so right. It's all about finding that sweet spot between being open to new things, but also not being naive.
Exactly. We don't want to just shut ourselves off from new ideas, especially spiritual ones, but we also don't want to blindly follow anyone.
Okay, so for our listeners out there who might be feeling a little overwhelmed by all this, what can they do? What are some ways to protect themselves and make good choices about who they trust and what they believe?
Well, the first thing to remember is that you're not alone in this. Groups and leaders like this, they're more common than you might think. And there are people out there who understand this stuff and can help.
That's good to hear. Any resources you'd recommend specifically?
Definitely. There's an organization called the International Cultic Studies Association, ICSA. They help people who have been involved with cults and high control groups. Their website has tons of information, articles, podcasts, even a list of therapists who specialize in this stuff.
Awesome. That sounds like a really good starting point for anyone who wants to learn more or maybe needs some guidance.
Yeah, and aside from that, I'd say just try to become a better critical thinker. Read about cults, about how people manipulate each other. Talk to people with different viewpoints. And I know it sounds cliche, but seriously, trust your gut feeling. If something feels wrong, there's a good chance it is.
It's so true. It's easy to ignore that little voice inside, especially when we're feeling vulnerable.
Ah.
But a lot of times, it's trying to tell us something really important.
Oh, absolutely. And if you're ever feeling pressured to do something or believe something, just take a step back. Don't rush into anything. Talk to someone you trust who's not in the group. Remember, you always have the right to say no.
That's so important. You don't have to give up your freedom to think for yourself just to be spiritual or be part of a community.
Nope, not at all. Healthy groups and good leaders, they'll want you to ask questions. They'll respect that everyone's different, and they'll care about how their members are doing more than anything else.
That's a perfect way to put it. I'd say this deep dive into the Science of Identity Foundation has been pretty eye-opening, to say the least. We've seen some pretty troubling stuff and talked about how power and belief can get all tangled up. But my hope is that our listeners are leaving this with a sense of, how to think for themselves, trust their instincts, and find communities that are actually good for them.
I agree. This has been a really interesting conversation, and I appreciate you having me on to talk about it.
It's been great having you here. And for anyone who wants to go deeper into the Science of Identity Foundation or anything else we talked about, all the sources are linked in the show notes.
And like always, keep asking those questions, keep learning, and keep diving deep with us.
Until next time, everyone.